Hey guys, tonight, we step into a secret the Tudor court spent centuries trying to bury: the truth behind King Henry VIII's final night. Imagine this. You're standing inside Whitehall Palace, where the cold creeps through every slab of stone, and the air feels so heavy it's as if someone is holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. In that darkness, you hear hurried footsteps, whispers cut short, and long stretches of silence so deep they make you wonder. If Henry VIII truly died from illness, then why were so many people terrified to even mention that moment? And the strangest part? Some witnesses claimed the king was still conscious, still speaking, just moments before he suddenly slipped into a sleep no one could wake him from. But who was in that room? Who walked in and out without signing their name? Who scrambled for power only minutes after the king took his last breath? If you're used to the public executions of the Tudor era, get ready, because this death had no sword, no blood, only silence. And silence, more than anything else, is the fastest killer of all. Honestly, if you had been inside that room that night, you probably wouldn't have survived it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to ask you one more thing. Where are you watching this from? Which city? Which country? What time is it where you are right now? Comment below and let me know whether you're listening to this story during a quiet evening or deep in a midnight when no one else is awake. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. For the next 40 minutes, our team simply will enter and release in a state of. In the final days before Henry VIII took his last breath, Whitehall Palace looked like a giant, furious beehive. In every corridor, every staircase, every doorway, someone lingered longer than usual, whispering to another, then instantly changing expression the moment a third person appeared. Everything happened quietly, yet with such pressure that if you placed your hand on the cold stone railing, you might swear you could feel the entire kingdom's pulse shrinking in fear. Henry VIII was still alive, but his power had already slipped from his hands and was leaking into the shadows, where factions large and small tore apart every scrap of advantage. You'd know this feeling if you've ever seen a company when the CEO suddenly falls ill. Everyone pretends to be concerned, but deep inside, they're calculating who's going to rise first. At Whitehall, those calculations weren't about promotion. They were about survival. The morning after Henry's delirious night, a thin layer of snow covered the rooftops. Ravens perched on wooden beams and croaked short, uneasy calls as if warning of something ominous. The usual palace noises, servants hauling water, guards training, felt delayed and uncertain. Everyone strained to hear updates from the king's chamber, where no one dared say aloud that time was running out. In that tension, two major factions emerged like opposite magnetic poles: the Catholic side around Stephen Gardiner and the Norfolk family, and the reformist group centered on Edward Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour and uncle to the young Prince Edward. Courtesy vanished. Their eyes were sharp, cold, and deliberate. When they crossed paths in the hallway, the servants standing nearby held their breath, afraid one wrong glance could ignite open hostility. A major historical moment happened during this exact period. Stephen Gardiner, once one of the sharpest minds in the kingdom, was banned from seeing the king. The decision hit the court like a thunderclap. No one knew whether Henry truly ordered it or whether the Seymours engineered it. But one thing was clear: whoever controlled access to the king's room controlled the future of England. And here's something few people know. During those final days, a list of names for the Regency Council, those who would rule after Henry's death, was written, then rewritten, then revised again. So many times that possessing the final version was like holding a political bomb. The document changed so often that modern historians still argue over which version was real. Outside the king's room, Catherine Parr, the sixth queen, appeared far less than you'd imagine. She spent most of her time in her private chambers, praying and writing. A rumor spread quickly through the ladies' quarters. She avoided Henry for fear he might suddenly turn on her. And honestly, considering Henry's history, that fear wasn't unreasonable. Only months earlier, he had nearly ordered her arrest for heresy before abruptly changing his mind. A plot twist that, if it happened today, would be all over social media as a meme. Historians still can't agree whether Catherine was being isolated or whether she chose to stay away. Some believe she feared being dragged into a power struggle. Others think the Seymour faction intentionally kept her within their household, because if she stood too close to the king at such a critical moment, the balance of power might tilt unpredictably. Meanwhile, Thomas Seymour, Edward's ambitious younger brother, seemed to appear everywhere, almost as if he wanted people to notice how busy he was. A humble smile, a gentle tone, but eyes full of ambition. The kind of person who says, "I don't care about power," while quietly changing the lock on the boss's office. Records show he repeatedly tried to approach the king's servants to ask just how far Henry's condition had progressed. In the Tudor court, murder didn't require poison or knives. Controlling information, the king is well, the king is weak, increase his medicine, decrease his medicine, was enough to shift the fate of the entire realm. Even trusted servants were bribed by rival factions just to report whether Henry was awake, delirious, or slipping toward death. That morning, the royal physicians gathered in the adjacent room. Much of what they discussed remains blurred by time. They spoke in low voices, as if the walls had ears, and in Tudor palaces, sometimes they practically did. A strange detail emerged. Every physician belonged to a different faction. Dr. Wendy leaned reformist. Dr. Butts had Catholic sympathies. Dr. Owen claimed neutrality, but often whispered to people he shouldn't have. This meant every medical decision, dosage, bandage changes, rest, became a political act. One doctor suggested increasing Henry's pain medicine. Another refused, saying it might worsen the delirium. A third offered the safest line imaginable. "Perhaps we should observe a little longer." The kind of sentence that protects the speaker but helps no one. Historians love debating this meeting, but they've never agreed whether the doctors intentionally worsened Henry's condition or simply wrestled with the primitive medical knowledge of the 16th century. As usual, the truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. Outside, the tension grew palpable. Nobles who once strutted loudly now walked stiff and cautious, straightening their cloaks, speaking softly, terrified that even a sideways glance might get them labeled as someone's enemy. Everyone tried to appear neutral, but neutrality in the Tudor world meant only one thing: no one trusted you. Rumors swirled that the powerful Howard family was trying to regain influence. Even though the Duke of Norfolk was imprisoned for treason, courtiers whispered that if Henry changed his mind at the last minute, Norfolk might return to power. Tudor fate was always sharp-edged. Today you're at the top, tomorrow you're forgotten in a cell. Servants brought food to the chambers, but no one ate. Anxiety makes swallowing impossible. It felt like waiting outside an exam room, hands cold, stomach empty. Except here, the exam was the fate of England. By midday, messages became chaotic and contradictory. Someone from the South Wing claimed the king was still conscious. Someone from the West insisted he hadn't opened his eyes. One said he heard groans. Another swore Henry muttered something in Latin, but the Latin changed every time he retold it. Historians still have no certainty about the king's final, lucid words. Some think he spoke of salvation. Others say he asked for Edward, his 9-year-old son. Some claim he whispered the name Jane Seymour, the only wife he truly loved. And of course, many believe all these stories are romantic inventions. That afternoon, the snow stopped. Weak sunlight appeared, but offered no warmth. A courtier exited the king's chamber, face ghost white. Someone waiting outside asked, "How is he?" The answer came slowly, every word measured. "There's not much time left. Prepare everything." From that moment, Whitehall stopped being a palace and became a giant chessboard. Every person was a piece moving silently, deliberately. The royal clerks reviewed records. The king's last signatures were examined to see whether they were truly his or guided by someone's hand. The wooden message boxes used for internal palace mail began working at a frantic pace. Couriers dashed through hallways with red wax-sealed letters. Amid the suffocating tension, moments of black humor slipped in among the servants. A young kitchen maid muttered, "If the king dies tonight, tomorrow our kitchen will work twice as hard, either for the nobles celebrating or the nobles crying." A grim joke, but accurate. Tudor life ran on ritual more than we run on deadlines. As evening approached, lamps flickered to life. A soft yellow glow swayed in the drafts slipping through palace cracks. Courtiers from each faction gathered in discreet rooms for quiet talks. No loud voices, no laughter, just murmurs, exchanged glances, subtle nods. Sometimes you'd catch fragments like, "Just make it to morning. Don't let him reach the chamber first. Stay silent until the order comes." No one mentioned Henry's death outright, but the meaning was unmistakable. A dynasty was waiting for its king's final breath, and chaos was waiting for that breath to escape. When night finally took over, the only warm light left in the palace was the candle burning outside Henry VIII's door, a light that flickered with every breath of wind, casting shadows like the anxious heartbeat of an empire. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood. This wasn't just a night of waiting for a death. It was the night of waiting for a war of power to begin. And everyone beneath Whitehall's roof, nobles and servants alike, felt the same truth pressing against their ribs. Alliances, grudges, ambition, fear, all of it stood behind that closed door, waiting for Henry VIII's final exhale to burst into the world. The Tudor dynasty had never been peaceful, but the king's last night was the night when chaos itself sat at the center, calm, patient, and ready to open its eyes. The corridors of Whitehall lay under the faint, dying glow of candles, and the air was so thick it felt as if every layer of atmosphere were holding its breath. That winter was bitter enough that the stones beneath the floor absorbed the cold and pushed it back into anyone who passed. In that heavy silence, the footsteps of the guards grew cautious, as if one loud sound might shift the fate of England with a single breath. At the end of the corridor, behind a heavy oak door, King Henry VIII lay, not the towering monarch the world knew, but a man exhausted, breathing heavily, his eyes unable to stay open for more than a few seconds. Surviving records describe him in December of 1546 as a flame burning low, ready to be snuffed out with even the softest touch. His legs were so swollen that servants had to adjust layer after layer of cloth to keep the skin from splitting. The court called it the leg ailment, but modern readers know it was diabetic ulcers and infection. An affliction the medicine of the 16th century could do little for beyond strong drink and whispered prayers. The air inside the king's chamber had a strange, sharp heaviness. The smell of ointments, burning wood, and something faintly metallic drifted around the bed, mixing with candlelight into a scent so peculiar that no one could decide whether it was comforting or terrifying. People of the time wrote that to mask the odor of the king's illness, servants burned expensive fragrant woods, what we'd consider luxury essential oils today. But no matter how much they burned, the room still felt like it was guarding a secret no one dared name. That night was unnaturally quiet. Only a handful of people were permitted inside, and they moved gently, as if the floorboards might collapse beneath them. A royal physician checked Henry's pulse while scribbling nervous notes. A courtier stood pressed into the shadows, watching every movement, not to assist, but to observe. At this moment, anyone who stood near the king's bedside might become the one who determined England's destiny. Henry opened his eyes now and then. Sometimes his lips moved, trying to speak, but the words dissolved before forming full sentences. Yet one detail survives in the records and still troubles historians today. He experienced a strange moment of clarity only hours before his condition worsened. Some accounts say he asked about government matters, even calling people by name. No one can explain this sudden burst of awareness. Modern researchers suggest it may have been the last light phenomenon, when a dying person becomes briefly lucid before passing. Others argue that heavy painkillers pushed him into a half-awake, half-delirious state, and as always, historians still debate it, each clinging to their theory, refusing to admit the other might make just as much sense. Outside the chamber, the factions grew more anxious by the minute. Reformists whispered that if Henry died that night, they must immediately protect Edward Seymour, who seemed destined to dominate the Regency Council. The Catholic faction saw the situation differently. If the Reformists gained control, they could be pushed out of court, or even purged. Everyone had motives. Everyone had fears. That final night was no longer about saying goodbye to a king. It was a political gamble, with each man watching Henry's breath as if it were a forecast of his own future. A cold draft slipped through the window, causing the candle beside Henry's bed to flicker. The trembling light cast distorted shadows across the walls, as though an extra figure stood in the room unnoticed. A physician bent over the king, examined him, then gave a small shake of his head to a nearby servant. The gesture said nothing explicitly, yet everyone present understood it. It didn't signal death. It signaled change. Because in a Tudor world, a king dying was ordinary. A king dying at a particular moment, that was what unleashed storms. A quiet voice in the corner muttered, "Wait until morning to announce it." A simple suggestion, loaded with consequence. Whoever delivered the news first would gain an upper hand in steering the Regency Council. Whoever delayed it would gain precious time to arrange alliances, and whoever fell behind would be finished. If you've ever seen co-workers scramble to report first to the boss to earn favor, you already understand a very soft-core version of what was happening inside that room. Tudor politics simply came without email, and with far deadlier consequences. At one point, Henry let out a low groan, weak, drained, yet still carrying the ghost of the man who once made Europe tremble. A doctor lifted a cup of medicated wine to his lips. Henry tried to swallow, but the liquid spilled down his chin. A servant hurried to wipe it away, trying to hide trembling hands. All of them understood that even the smallest mistake could be twisted into a crime. King or no king, breath or no breath. Strangely, official records say very little about Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife. Where was she that night? Was she allowed in the room, or kept away to protect some faction's plan? Historians still argue whether she was absent by force or by choice, and why her silence felt so unsettling. Time moved slowly, as if every minute stretched under the weight of dread. Each person in the room wore a different expression, some anxious, some hopeful, some carrying a flicker of something that looked almost like relief. A relief that, if spoken aloud, would horrify any modern listener. But the Tudor court was no place for idealists dreaming of loyalty and devotion. Henry exhaled deeply, a long, strained breath, as though he were gathering whatever strength remained to hold on to life. Then his body eased, and the room sank into a silence that felt like the moment before a summer storm. No rain yet, but inevitable. A servant bowed his head. A physician clutched his notebook. A courtier turned away, hiding his eyes so no one could read what he truly felt. Outside the door, those standing in the hallway leaned forward, listening for any hint of what had happened. Footnote: it is likely most people who have seen death in action have had to lead their domestic unease through fear, as they have seen death attack them, making them dirty or stupefied like a stone. No one spoke loudly. No one cried. No one screamed. In the Tudor world, silence was how one acknowledged a king's death. And sometimes, silence was how one buried the truth. Henry VIII had not yet taken his final breath, but everyone in that room sensed it. Tonight was the threshold. And more terrifying than death itself were the schemes moving just beyond the candlelight, like stretched shadows pulled thin by the rise and fall of power. Those inside the chamber waited for one thing, the moment the king's breath faded into the air. Because then, not only would a reign end, a new battle would begin. A battle no one wanted to name, yet one everyone had prepared for. And when the last candle in the room dimmed, you could feel it more clearly than ever. The death of Henry VIII was never just a death. It was the beginning of a mystery that 500 years later, the world still hasn't solved. The night after Henry VIII slipped into deep delirium, the atmosphere inside Whitehall changed in a way that defies simple description. It was no longer just the ordinary chill of an English winter, but the cold of suspicion, of whispers that seemed to slip through cracks in the walls where candlelight couldn't reach. The corridors felt longer, the curtains heavier, and even the wind brushing across the rooftops sounded strangely untrustworthy. You could feel that Whitehall had become a living body, tightening its muscles, bracing for a shift everyone knew was coming, yet no one dared to speak aloud. The greatest fear wasn't whether the king would die, but how he would die. And from the dimmest corners of the palace, a rumor began to spark, spreading from servants to courtiers, from courtiers to those quietly watching the night. Henry VIII wasn't merely ill. Someone might be helping his illness along. What made the rumor terrifying was the fact that it wasn't entirely unreasonable. In 16th century Europe, poisoning was nothing new, but it was always effective. Every court from Italy to France bore its scars, and the Tudors were no exception. But with Henry VIII, a man who terrified an entire kingdom with a single decree, the idea that someone might dare to harm him sounded both outrageous and somehow disturbingly plausible. No one foolish enough would use a fast, obvious poison. That would be too easy to trace. If someone wanted Henry dead, they would choose a method that made him decline slowly, naturally, subtly enough that even his physicians might believe it was fate. When scholars gathered stray notes, the king's symptoms and inconsistencies in the royal apothecary, a troubling pattern emerged. To some modern researchers, it felt like Henry may have been poisoned very slowly, the kind of poison that behaves like frost, painless at first, but rotting everything one breath at a time. Naturally, historians still argue endlessly. One side calls it baseless conspiracy. The other shrugs and asks, then how do you explain all the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning? And so the debate never ends, as if history intentionally left a blurred corner for future generations to fill with imagination. During Henry's last months, records mention 3 unusual signs that still puzzle scholars. First, his skin color changed constantly. Ashen gray one day, flushed red like a drunk leaving a tavern the next. Second, his mood swung violently, one moment laughing into empty space, the next shouting at a servant because a cup sat 2 inches off center. And strangest of all, his heartbeat raced so fast it was nearly impossible to measure, then slowed to a crawl as if he were fading away. These symptoms are not shocking in modern medical literature, but they are the classic signatures of arsenic and antimony poisoning. Then came the detail that makes every modern reader exhale in disbelief. Many of the medicines Henry took daily already contained heavy metals. 16th century medicine believed metals could pull sickness out of the body, a logic not unlike modern detox fads. Except Tudor detox sometimes sent people much farther than intended. If someone wanted to harm Henry, they didn't need exotic poisons. They only had to adjust the doses of what he was already being given. No dramatic plots, no elaborate schemes, just a quiet increase, slow enough that no one would notice. Inside Whitehall, suspicion began to circle around the royal physicians. They were the only ones allowed to touch the medicines, the wounds, the drinks. Every decision, more medicine, less medicine, a different ointment, could directly affect Henry VIII's life. One doctor was caught by a servant altering a formula without noting it in the ledger. He claimed it was just a small change for pain relief. But in such a sensitive moment, the excuse felt like a thin cloth laid over a blade. Another doctor was said to leave the king's chamber late at night and head to the apothecary with a tense expression. No one asked, no one followed. The Tudor court was a place where one wrong question could cost you tomorrow. The irony is that historians today can't even agree on how many medicines Henry was taking in his final week. Records are missing, altered, or gone entirely. This raises a question no one can answer. Did someone deliberately erase the trail? If not the physicians, then suspicion naturally shifted to the king's closest servants. They were the ones who mixed his drinks, applied his ointments, changed his bandages, and were sometimes the only people beside him when no noble or physician was present. Servants had no official power, but they held the strange power of proximity, the same way a receptionist knows every secret in the company without ever being in charge, unless someone pays them to speak. One eerie detail rarely mentioned. Immediately after Henry's death, one close servant abruptly disappeared from Whitehall. No leave requested, no resignation, no transfer, gone, and the name never appeared in any record again. That silence was so absolute it made people shiver. But those who understood politics focused higher. They said, servants are just servants. If there was a real plot, it would come from someone with true motive, someone like Edward Seymour, who would become Lord Protector, or Thomas Seymour, who always wanted to outshine his brother, or Stephen Gardiner, the powerful bishop suddenly pushed out of the inner circle. Each of them had something to gain if Henry died at just the right time. Edward Seymour needed Henry gone to solidify his authority. If Henry lived long enough to sign a few more decrees, his plans might crumble. Thomas Seymour's ambitions were so blatant that no one in court believed he'd simply stand aside. Gardiner was perhaps the only one who wanted Henry to live a little longer, but if Henry regained clarity and signed a damaging order, Gardiner's career would be finished. Worst of all, no one had proof against any of them. Everyone had motive. Everyone had opportunity. Everyone could have done it, which meant no one could be ruled out. One afternoon, as wind swept across the courtyard, Dr. Owen stepped out of the king's chamber with a look both heavy and strangely relieved. No one knew what he had seen. But from that moment, Henry's condition worsened so suddenly it startled everyone. Some said it was natural progression. Others stayed silent because natural arrived at an awfully convenient time. That evening, in the palace kitchen, a young servant muttered half-jokingly, "The king's death is probably scheduled more precisely than our dinner," and though the line sounded humorous, no one denied it. Because everyone felt it, though no one dared admit it. If Henry VIII died from illness, that was fate. If he died from poison, that was a secret, and no one had a reason to uncover it. As the candle outside the king's door quivered in the draught, its shadow stretched across the floor like a soft blade, and in that moment, Whitehall understood something with chilling clarity. Death was drawing near, but truth was slipping farther away. And then, like an exhale spreading through the palace, the rumor of poison stopped being a rumor. It became part of the story, one that would cling to Henry VIII's name for centuries to come. Never proven, yet believed, just enough. Whitehall Palace, in the days when Henry VIII's health began to collapse, grew quiet in a strange, unsettling way. A silence like still water before a storm breaks. In the thick atmosphere of calculation and rivalry, there was one figure everyone watched, yet no one dared address directly: Catherine Parr, the king's final wife, the woman who had survived the blade of execution through sheer intellect and careful words, and the only queen Henry had ever tried to arrest simply for arguing theology with the wrong man. Catherine Parr was not the kind of woman history paints as tragic or dreamy. She was deeply educated, a published author, fluent in Latin, capable of debating theology on equal ground with male scholars, something a 16th century woman was absolutely not supposed to do if she wanted to stay alive. On top of that, she leaned toward religious reform at a time when the Tudor court was split down the middle like a tectonic fault between two political worlds. Just months before Henry grew gravely ill, she nearly faced arrest on charges of heresy. Henry had become furious when she debated doctrine too confidently, but Catherine turned the situation around with what many later called one of history's greatest intellectual escapes. She told Henry she only argued to distract him from his pain and calm his troubled mind. Henry heard this, softened instantly, and even apologized for misunderstanding her, a dramatic turn, and proof that Catherine Parr understood Henry in a way no one else ever could. But that understanding, in the eyes of those watching the balance of power, made her the most unpredictable piece on the board. As the king's condition worsened, Catherine did not visit him as often as people assume, or more accurately, she couldn't. There were days she was told to remain in her private chamber, away from internal discussions, away from the piercing eyes of the Seymour faction and the Catholic faction as they circled each other like two starving beasts, and that isolation remains one of the great points of contention among historians. Some believe Catherine Parr kept her distance for emotional safety. Others suspect the Seymours deliberately pushed her aside to control everything that happened inside the king's room. Whatever the reason, Catherine's absence in Henry's final days left an odd emptiness, like a central character stepping off stage just as the play reached its climax. To servants accustomed to seeing her sit beside Henry, holding his hand, reading prayers to him, her disappearance was a troubling sign. Women in the royal household whispered that Catherine cried alone in her chamber, but those who truly understood her knew she was not the kind who let tears dictate her choices. If she cried, that was only the surface. Beneath it lay the careful calculations of a woman who had witnessed too many cold-blooded maneuvers within the Tudor court. There's one detail many forget. Catherine Parr had once been the guardian of Princess Elizabeth, teaching the girl philosophy, theology, and languages. Elizabeth's sharp mind and early maturity came largely from Catherine herself, so when Henry's strength faded, Catherine knew clearly that the king's death would mean far more than personal loss. It would ignite a political war, and Elizabeth's future would be dragged into its center. That knowledge made the last queen grow quieter, more contemplative. People recalled seeing her stand at the window for long moments, fingers wrapped around her prayer beads, saying nothing. But anyone who saw her face then would know. Catherine wasn't praying for Henry to live. She was calculating how to survive without being crushed between the two massive forces colliding around her. A lesser-known but crucial event occurred just weeks before Henry's decline. Catherine Parr tried to persuade him to sign additional decrees protecting Elizabeth and Mary. Records suggest Henry agreed, but the drafts disappeared for a time, only to reappear later in versions no one could confidently confirm as authentic. It's the kind of moment that makes historians squint suspiciously. As news spread through Whitehall that Henry grew weaker each day, Catherine Parr became the center of a flurry of rumors. The Catholic faction suspected she had a hand in what the king drank or heard. The reformists worried she might switch sides if it benefited her. Some even whispered she avoided the sick room because she didn't want to witness something unnatural. The rumors drifted like smoke, from kitchen to sewing room to scriptorium, then up into the noble halls. And who could blame them? Catherine's absence created a void, an unlit corner, and everyone wanted to peer inside. A young maid in the women's quarters once murmured, "A queen locked in her chamber while the king is dying, that's scarier than poison," a line that sounded like gossip but cut sharp as a knife. What startled many was Catherine's lack of resistance. She didn't fight the separation. She let the doors close, let the rumors spread, let people craft whatever stories they wished. And that silence made her unreadable. Was she grieving? Or preparing a move too intricate for anyone to anticipate? Some courtiers loyal to her insisted she wrote many letters during this period, but those letters, like so much else tied to Henry VIII's final days, vanished. All that remains is the knowledge that Catherine had the gentle soul of a writer, but the sharp mind of a strategist. If she wrote anything, it likely wasn't mourning. It was coordination. Letters to those she trusted, letters preparing for the world after Henry. Eventually, Catherine Parr was allowed into the king's chamber once, just once, in his final days. Records do not say how long she stayed. They preserve only one line. The queen spoke softly at the king's bedside. No one recorded her words, only the scene, a trembling candle, Catherine's shadow rising on the wall, Henry breathing heavily, as if both carried far more to say than the time allowed. Some believe Catherine offered calm reassurance, urging him to trust the future. Others think she warned him that power would be twisted if he didn't give final instructions. And, naturally, some prefer the dramatic version, that she whispered her farewell, her eyes holding more than sorrow, the look of someone who knows she is about to walk into a political minefield with no shield left. Curiously, Henry's condition worsened more rapidly after that visit. No one accused Catherine Parr, and she likely had nothing to do with it. But the timing was too perfect, too convenient, giving fuel to those who needed threads for their theories. As always, historians split into two camps. One sees Catherine Parr as intelligent, aware of power, and determined to protect herself. The other suspects quiet ambition, a woman standing between factions and waiting for the right moment to step forward. Neither side is entirely wrong, and neither has evidence to silence the other. On Henry's last night, Catherine Parr stayed in her room. No one summoned her. No one rushed to inform her when the final moment came. In the larger picture, she became a silent note, present but fading under the roaring chords of political struggle. And the irony is brutal. The woman who weathered so many storms with Henry was not at his side when he left the world. At that moment, Whitehall tightened as if the entire palace were holding its breath, waiting to see what Catherine Parr would do next. She understood that Henry's death was not an ending, it was a comma, leading into a new sentence, one she would be written into whether she wished it or not. And then, in a silence thin as thread, one chapter closed. Another opened. Bull stepped briefly out of the spotlight. But history kept its eyes on her, the way it watches a shadow that never truly leaves the stage. From the moment Henry VIII began sinking into his long, unbroken delirium, the corridors of Whitehall saw one figure more often than anyone else. Thomas Seymour, the man whose smile always looked as if he had just won a bet, and whose eyes constantly flickered with calculations far too complex to be called good intentions. If Whitehall were a stage, Thomas Seymour would be the supporting actor, who insisted on stepping into the spotlight, whether or not the script mentioned him. Thomas was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, the man almost guaranteed to become Lord Protector if Henry died. But while Edward ruled with cold steadiness and quiet authority, Thomas chased power with impulsiveness and a hunger that bordered on reckless. History calls him handsome, charming, worldly, but those who lived alongside him whispered a different truth. He was handsome in the way that made women sigh and made men want to lock up their valuables. As with all ambitious men, Thomas Seymour appeared in Whitehall far more than necessary during Henry's final weeks. He had no official role in the king's care, yet somehow always had a reason to be nearby, checking the guards, asking after the king, confirming rumors, or simply being in the right place at the right time. If Henry so much as sneezed, Thomas was almost certainly within hearing distance. His constant presence made sharp-eyed onlookers uneasy. Servants murmured that whenever bad news came from the king's chamber, Thomas was soon spotted near the apothecary or kitchen. Courtiers whispered that he drifted through the hallways counting who went in and out of the sick room. Those who understood Tudor politics best knew one thing: anyone who appears too often where they have no duty is never there by accident. Many believed Thomas Seymour wanted to control the flow of information, and in the Tudor world, information was power. Knowing Henry's condition even a few hours before everyone else was enough to manipulate the board before anyone realized the pieces had moved. What made it unsettling was that Thomas was not patient. In a court where calm was a shield, he wore his emotions for all to see, revealing exactly what everyone suspected he was thinking. How long will Henry survive, and how long do I have to wait? No one dared speak it aloud, but no one failed to think it. One true historical detail, often buried beneath the grander narratives, is that Thomas Seymour once arranged to enter the king's room without being summoned. Servants who witnessed it said he walked in with such confidence that even the guards hesitated, as though he truly believed he had the right. And if you were a servant trapped between a dying king and an overly ambitious lord, you would understand exactly why they did not stop him. Complicating matters further was Thomas's smile. It was not the smile of a man concerned for a patient. It was the smile of someone looking into his own future and seeing a door swinging open. Few historians detail Thomas's behavior during this period, but scholars of the Edward VI era agree on one thing. Thomas Seymour believed his moment had come. Henry VIII was failing, Prince Edward was too young, Catherine Parr lacked trust from both factions, and Edward Seymour was on the edge of power. If Thomas wanted a place near the top, now was the moment to strike. Anyone in Whitehall who watched Thomas greet people sensed the same thing. He was not cruel in a bloodthirsty way, but he was absolutely capable of doing whatever it took to become the main character of the story. And that, more than cruelty, is the most dangerous trait of all. A little-known but crucial fact: Thomas Seymour had a habit of whining over servants with small gifts, sweet words, and the occasional coin. This made him extremely popular in the lower ranks, a clever tactic that also raised questions. If someone wanted inside knowledge of the king, befriending the servants was the smartest way possible. It was the kind of subtle influence that nudges water down a pipe, gentle but with direction. And in Tudor England, those tiny information streams could tilt the balance of an entire government. Some whispered that Thomas asked servants about Henry's medicines, who administered them, who supervised them, when bandages were changed, when wounds were cleaned. He asked with a light tone, friendly even, but everyone understood those questions never came from genuine concern. Modern historians still debate whether Thomas Seymour truly interfered with Henry's health. The cautious camp says he merely cared about the royal household. The skeptical camp lifts an eyebrow, points to the timing, and says, this was never simple concern. As usual, the truth lies between extremes, no solid evidence, but nothing strong enough to dismiss suspicion. In those final days, Thomas Seymour walked Whitehall like a man on a tightrope, either steps away from immense power or steps away from a fatal fall. No one looked at him without sensing his intentions. He walked quickly, chin high, eyes burning with expectation. One evening, while Henry was deep in fever and delirium, Thomas lingered outside the guard station near the king's chamber. He stood with his hands behind his back, staring into the doorway as if he could see through the wood itself. A guard later wrote in his memoir that Thomas remained there for nearly 10 minutes, silent and motionless. Then, he gave a small smile. a smile that chilled the guard, and walked away. For those who knew how to read such things, that silence was more frightening than any spoken threat. Then came an event, seemingly small but later viewed as a turning point. Thomas Seymour visited Catherine Parr after an afternoon when Henry's condition had worsened. The two had known each other before Catherine married the king. Some even whispered Thomas had once courted her. Meeting now, in this context, lit every candle of suspicion. No one knew what they said. All that is known is that Catherine stayed behind closed doors much longer afterward, while Thomas walked away with a face caught between doubt and satisfaction, the expression of someone who heard exactly what he wanted, but wasn't sure he should trust it. Historians still argue endlessly about this meeting. Some believe Thomas sought Catherine's support when the regime changed. Others think he tried to charm her into giving him information from the women's quarters. And some speculate Catherine threatened him, warning him to keep quiet. No theory has proof, and that lack of proof is precisely what makes the moment so haunting. As night settled and the candles flickered in the drafty halls, Thomas Seymour paced the courtier's wing, his expression sharpening by the minute. People exchanged wary glances, but didn't dare ask questions. Everyone knew what he was waiting for, the king's last breath. When the chapel bell rang for midnight prayers, Thomas appeared once more near Henry's chamber. He did not enter, but his shadow stretched long across the stone floor, so long that those passing by instinctively stepped aside. People often say darkness itself isn't frightening. What's frightening is the person standing inside it. In that moment, Whitehall seemed to whisper a truth. There are men who kill without touching their victims. They only stand in the right place at the right time and wait. And if Henry VIII was truly pushed toward his death, Thomas Seymour would forever be one of the names history looks at with an unsuspicion that never fades. That night, while everyone listened for the king's weakening breaths, Thomas Seymour listened for something else, the shifting gears of power, and no one could deny it. He heard it more clearly than anyone. If Thomas Seymour was the shadow that flickered through Whitehall, then Stephen Gardiner was the shadow people deliberately pushed out of the candlelight. In the Tudor world, there were two kinds of danger, those who moved silently and those who were silently removed. Gardiner fell into the second category, and that alone made the silence around him more suspicious than any whisper. Gardiner had once been one of the sharpest intellects in the kingdom, a man balanced at the fragile intersection of faith, politics, and law. He wasn't handsome like Thomas Seymour, nor imposing like Edward Seymour, nor magnetic like Catherine Parr, but he possessed something the others did not, a mind Henry VIII trusted enough to hand over the fate of the English Church. Henry rarely trusted anyone, so that trust was as powerful as any royal decree. And yet, when Henry VIII lay bedridden, Stephen Gardiner, once a pillar beside the throne, was not allowed anywhere near the sick room. The door shut in his face, without explanation, without apology. This was no accident. It was a deliberate choice, and possibly the most important clue in the entire mystery of Henry's final days. Servants recalled Gardiner standing before the sealed door, as though he were trying to read the secrets happening inside. But he did not shout, did not pound his fists, did not intimidate the guards. He simply stared for a long moment, then walked away with shoulders heavy, the posture of a man who understood he had just been cut out of the game, and when a man like Gardiner is removed, that is never a small thing. Modern historians still debate why Henry, or more accurately, those around Henry, ordered Gardiner to be excluded. Some argue the king feared he would influence the final will. Others say the Seymour faction feared Gardiner might persuade Henry during a rare moment of clarity to sign an order that threatened their rise. The boldest theories whisper something darker, that Gardiner knew something no one wanted spoken aloud. None of the camps have proof, and that lack of proof only makes the story more dangerous. What made Gardiner most threatening wasn't the power he once held. It was the power he lost at exactly the right moment, as if someone had calculated the perfect time to neutralize an old lion who still had claws. And once the lion was kept outside, those inside no longer had to fear getting bitten. In those days, Gardiner moved through Whitehall like a man navigating fog. He appeared in political wings, in quiet meeting rooms, and inside the legal archives, where drafts of laws, wills, and unsigned documents were stored. Servants said he spent hours reading and writing, eyes reddened by candlelight. No one knew what he was preparing, but the Tudors had a saying: the person not invited is usually the one preparing the most. One afternoon, Gardiner discovered his name had been struck from the list of members for the Regency Council, not just removed but crossed out in thick ink, like a deliberate message to future readers that he was never to be allowed near power again. And this is a real historical fact. In the final version of Henry's will, Stephen Gardiner's name is missing, despite having been among the king's closest advisors for years. So what happened behind that locked sick room door that erased such a powerful man? Historians argue themselves breathless. Some say Henry no longer trusted Gardiner for being too Catholic. Some say the Seymours altered the documents, adding and removing names. Others believe Henry was too weak to read the final copy, and those around him guided his signature without telling him what had changed. All theories are possible, which means none can be declared absolutely true. One evening, as a cold wind from the Thames blew into Whitehall and extinguished several candles, Gardiner stood alone in the great hall. He looked up at the carved wooden ceiling, his eyes turning hard as stone. Those who walked past recognized the silence, not the silence of despair, but the silence of calculation, the silence of a man who knew he was losing a battle, but had not yet conceded the war. Gardiner understood better than anyone the danger of being pushed outside the center of power. In the Tudor court, stepping even an inch away from the king's influence meant standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the smallest breeze to send you falling. He was not a man to surrender easily, and the fact that he was blocked from seeing Henry convinced many that Gardiner possessed knowledge too important or too dangerous for the Seymour faction to risk. Some whispered that Gardiner tried to send letters into the king's chamber, but they were returned unopened. There is even a half-legend, half-recorded note claiming Gardiner once stood beneath the king's window at midnight, watching the candlelight flicker inside as he whispered a prayer. His connection to power had been severed, yet he still clung to the hope that Henry might call for him one last time. But Henry never called, or perhaps he no longer had the strength. What makes this chapter so unnerving is that Gardiner did not resist publicly. He staged no rebellion, made no accusations, overturned no tables. He simply stepped back one careful pace, not out of fear, but out of understanding. In that moment, noise could be twisted into treason. Silence was his last line of protection. Well, and yet within that same silence, he became the darkest shape in the whole picture. Why was the man who had stood beside Henry VIII in some of the most important decisions of the king's reign suddenly barred from the final hours of his life? No one can answer, or no one wants to. If Catherine Parr was suspicious for her absence, and Thomas Seymour suspicious for his constant presence, then Stephen Gardiner represented a third, more chilling kind of suspicion. The suspicion created by deliberate exclusion. And often, the thing kept most hidden is the thing most worth worrying about. Perhaps the most frightening question is not that Gardiner was kept away from Henry, but what he might have said, prevented, or revealed. What he might have said, prevented, or revealed if he had been allowed in and said. And because he was not allowed in, history never heard his final words. On the night Henry hovered near death, Gardiner stood in the eastern wing, listening to the chapel bells echo in heavy tones. He did not cry, did not collapse, but the candlelight reflected a helplessness he had never shown in his entire career. In the shifting of power, those standing in the wrong spot are buried first. And Gardiner understood that better than anyone. Henry VIII was not yet dead, but power had already left him, drifting down the corridors like a cold draft and settling onto those close enough to catch it. Gardiner stood too far, far enough that suspicion wrapped itself around him like a second shadow. Perhaps he never realized that being shut out from that sick room on that specific night would cast his name into one of history's deepest, most enduring mysteries. We've often wondered if Morgan was truly different from most of the men who missed things. And on that freezing night in Whitehall, Stephen Gardiner became proof of an ancient Tudor truth. In the war for power, sometimes the person barred from entering the room is the one people fear the most. In the final days of Henry VIII's life, the most frightening thing wasn't the king's cough, nor the long stretches of unconsciousness during which servants had to press a hand to his chest just to check whether he was still breathing. What terrified people most were the closed doors behind him, doors behind which England's future was discussed in voices so low that even the walls seemed to lean in, trying to listen. Because in Whitehall at that moment, everything revolved around a single document: the king's last will and testament, a piece of paper capable of lifting someone to the highest seat of power or erasing a man's entire career with a single missing name. No one knew exactly what Henry dictated during his rare lucid moments. No one knew how many hands had touched the document. But everyone understood one thing: this wasn't merely a will, it was a treasure map of power, and whoever controlled it, controlled England. To understand the tension inside Whitehall, imagine the palace as a darkened room where the stake is the throne and the rule of the game is brutally simple. Anyone who acts one beat too slowly becomes a casualty of history. Servants later whispered that in the last 2 weeks of Henry's life, the will was taken out, put away, edited, checked, re-edited, so many times that even the scribes began to lose track. One day, it appeared in the Privy Council chamber. That night, it lay on the secretary's table. By morning, someone saw it in Edward Seymour's hands, and by afternoon, another version surfaced, with details that didn't match the earlier one. The unsettling truth, completely historical, is that no original draft survives. What we have today are copies, recopies, cross-checked versions, all proved by the very men who benefited most when Henry died. One modern historian once murmured, softly, almost as if afraid Whitehall itself might be listening, that the total disappearance of a royal will from a court famous for obsessive record-keeping simply could not have happened naturally. What made everything worse was Henry's absence from his own story. The entire palace argued, whispered, and speculated about his will while he lay in bed, too weak for anyone to know whether he still understood what was being carried out in his name. A courtier recorded that Henry in his final days could only wake for a few minutes at a time, speaking a handful of disconnected words. No one knew how much he comprehended, whether he could read anything, or whether he truly signed what later appeared with his name. But signatures still materialized, pages still bore seals, and the document still received approvals, as if someone else had quietly stepped in to finish the king's work. If, in previous days, Thomas Seymour looked suspiciously close to the sick room and Stephen Gardiner suspiciously far, then the central figure of the will was neither of them. It was Edward Seymour, soon to become Duke of Somerset and, more importantly, the Regent of England. Edward was reserved, patient, and had the air of a man convinced that everything would fall neatly into his hands if he simply waited for the right moment. But waiting wasn't enough. Preparation was required, and the will was the document that required the most preparation. By law, 8 witnesses were needed to validate it. Yet the mystery lies in when they signed, whether they were all present at once, whether they witnessed Henry sign, or whether they simply approved a document placed before them. No one knows. There is only a single servant's whisper that one evening 8 men were summoned, but none of them saw Henry awake. Another odd detail was the role of Anthony Denny, Henry's closest gentleman, the only man allowed into the king's room without restriction. He was the one who formally declared that it was time to tell the king he was near death, a ritual required for legal steps surrounding the will. But the contradiction is this: no one can confirm Henry ever heard the message. Denny's words became the legal trigger for finalizing the will, yet even that moment feels swallowed by shadow. Some believe he simply followed duty. Others think he acted precisely when Edward Seymour needed him to. And a few more cynical voices note that whoever controls the moment a king is told he is dying also controls the narrative of history. Then comes the detail that startles every historian. The handwriting of Henry's final will does not belong to Henry, nor to his secretary, nor to any regular court scribe. It belongs to someone unknown. The signature reads Henry R., but the text is far too neat, too calm, too uniform for a document produced while the king was on his deathbed. Worse still, the marginal notes, circles, emphasis marks, small adjustments, match the writing habits of men aligned with the Seymour fact. Some scholars state bluntly that Henry's last will may be legitimate in content, but it was not produced legitimately. By the night Henry died, the will was ready, clean, complete, containing all the names that needed to be included, and conspicuously missing the names that needed to disappear. No one summoned Catherine Parr to verify it. No one informed Stephen Gardiner. No one checked whether Henry had been aware at all. But everyone who needed to be in the room was there, at exactly the right moment. When word of the king's death spread, servants said Edward Seymour moved with the calm of someone who had rehearsed the moment for days. Thomas Seymour appeared almost at once, his smile too quick and too bright to be called sorrow. Gardiner, Henry's longtime trusted advisor, was informed last. And that delay is what turned the will into the final piece of a chilling theory. Henry VIII did not die alone. His death was shaped by calculations, and his will was the central gear in that machinery. The next day, when the document was opened before the council, no one protested, no one questioned anything, no one objected to a single clause. In a kingdom where disputes erupted over everything, religion, taxes, Henry's marriages, the silence around the will was too perfect in the most unnerving way. That silence said everything without speaking. It said that every faction had secured what it wanted. It said that those excluded no longer had the strength to resist. It said that the will had been finalized exactly as the strongest players intended. From that moment onward, England entered the reign of Edward VI, but many inside Whitehall understood the quiet truth. This new age was not born from Henry's authority. It was born from a room where Henry VIII was no longer conscious enough to intervene. And so the final chapter of Henry's life was not a death. It was a performance in darkness, where the fate of a nation was rewritten with ink, parchment, and a few whispered words spoken in the king's name. The will ends like a legal document, but it begins like a warning. Uneven, ominous, unforgettable. When a king no longer has the strength to resist, it is the court that decides how he lives, how he dies, and what he leaves behind. And in those cold Whitehall nights, the palace understood one truth better than anyone. Sometimes the death of a king is not an ending at all, but the moment when power grows its sharpest teeth. The night Henry VIII left this world was not a grand tragic night, nor was it marked by the blare of ceremonial trumpets. It felt more like a thick fog settling over Whitehall, tightening every breath inside the palace. The London sky had turned the color of ash since early evening, casting a pale drifting light through the corridors that made the candles seem smaller and the shadows stretch unnaturally long. Servants walked on softened steps, guards held their backs straight without daring to shift their weight, and courtiers spoke to one another in voices so low it sounded as if they were trying not to awaken something sleeping inside the stone walls. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. This would be the final night of Henry VIII's reign, and perhaps the most dangerous night of his life. Inside the sick room, Henry lay still beneath the heavy blankets, his face stripped of the fierce red that once made people fearful, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar pallor. In the trembling candlelight, he no longer resembled the formidable king the world knew, but a man exhausted all the way to the bone. His breath came in uneven waves, sometimes so faint that servants leaned forward just to confirm he was still alive. The room was large, but so silent that the only sound left was the wind slipping through the cracks of the window frame. That silence wasn't natural. It was the silence of a chamber that had witnessed too many decisions capable of reshaping an entire kingdom, and now had only enough strength left to guard the last warmth of its master. Anthony Denny, the most trusted of Henry's gentlemen, stood at the door like a carved statue. Among all his duties, one weighed heaviest. He had to tell the king that his final hour had come. But before the bed today, even that tradition lost its clarity. Henry was almost beyond awareness, and the ritual itself became something suspended, unfinished. Still, Denny stepped closer, placing his hand over Henry's, the same hand that had once signed the most powerful decrees in England. He whispered, as if afraid his voice might shatter the fragile air inside the room, "Your Majesty, it is time to prepare." There was no response, no nod, no glance, only the slow, thinning breath, sliding away like a river, fading at the end of a season. Meanwhile, in other chambers of Whitehall, power had begun to move. Edward Seymour walked the corridor with a face stripped of emotion, carrying the cold precision of someone who had already calculated every step ahead. He had held on to the will for days, and with it the central position in the coming transfer of rule. Thomas Seymour was present too, standing in a corner like a man waiting for an invisible signal. His usual smirk was gone. In its place was a restless gaze, scanning every detail, measuring the exact moment when power would tilt. And Stephen Gardiner? He stood far from the center of events, barred from entering the sick room despite being the man Henry had trusted most for years. He remained at the end of the corridor, as if Whitehall itself kept him at the perfect distance to ensure he witnessed nothing that no one wanted him to see. 3 men, 3 positions, and it was that contrast that made Henry's final night feel like a chessboard poised to change masters. When darkness finally settled, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned. He did not come to debate or advise, but to perform the last rite of a king caught between 2 faiths. He sat beside Henry and offered prayers so soft that a single breeze could have blown the words apart. When Cranmer asked whether the king still placed his trust in God's mercy, Henry, half drifting, half awake, could manage only one gesture. He squeezed Cranmer's hand. Just a small, fragile squeeze. But it was the last signal his body sent to the world. Not a dramatic final line, not a political command. Just the quiet assent of a man who had reached the far edge of weariness. Then came the final breath, arriving in absolute silence. No gasp, no collapse, no tragic display. Only the moment when Henry's chest stopped its faint rise, and Whitehall, like a living creature, seemed to know it, even before the witnesses inside the room. A servant gently pulled the curtain closed. A guard lowered his halberd. Courtiers looked at one another not with grief but with the understanding that the transition had begun. In the Tudor world, death was never the end. It was the opening drumbeat. Edward was the first to leave the room, walking with the certainty of a man already stepping into his new role. Thomas followed, eyes bright with the fierce anticipation of someone who had waited far too long for this turning point. Gardiner remained frozen like a dark silhouette, knowing his fate had just been sealed without a chance to argue his way back into relevance. And amid all this movement, something strange happened. The wind over the Thames shifted direction, just a small change, but enough to make servants flinch. In English folklore, they say the wind changes on nights of great upheaval, and tonight, that upheaval bore a name. Henry VIII. The king died without a final statement, without a last message, without clarity for the generations to come, but he left behind a question that has echoed for 5 centuries. Did Henry VIII die of illness, or did he die in a political game he was no longer conscious enough to finish? Whitehall knew the answer. But Whitehall, then and always, kept its secrets to itself. The first morning after Henry VIII's death didn't feel like a morning at all. The London sky seemed unwilling to wake, and the fog clung to the surface of the Thames so heavily that anyone standing on one bank could swear the other side had vanished. Whitehall was washed in pale gray, not the gray of morning, but the gray of footsteps rumbling beneath the surface, as if something was moving under the floorboards. No one cried, no one spoke the king's name. There were no funeral rites, no proclamations, no trumpets. Instead, there was a strange silence, the kind of silence that suggested the court was trying to hide the truth for a few hours, just long enough to arrange what needed to be arranged before the outside world learned the news. The records from that day are almost completely empty, and that is the most disturbing detail of all. The Tudor court documented everything, down to someone purchasing half a bucket of coal. Yet, on the morning after Henry's death, there is not a single clear line about what happened inside the palace, as if everything had been erased, or never allowed to be written in the first place. What posterity knows comes only from scattered servant accounts, small fragments that, when pieced together, paint a picture far more suspicious than anything that happened the night before. In the hall near the main gate, Edward Seymour appeared first. He wore no mourning black. He carried no grief. He entered like a man who had already held power long before this moment. The fire in the hearth hadn't even burned out when Edward called for the keeper of the royal seal. The unforgettable moment came when Edward held out his hand and said a single sentence that a servant managed to record. "It's time. Not it's time to announce the sad news, not it's time to prepare the funeral, but it's time for the transfer of power." Before the king's death had even been made public. And the strangest part? No one objected. Not a single "but, my lord," not even a hesitant glance. The royal seal, the ultimate symbol of authority in England, was placed into Edward's hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. While Edward secured his role as regent, Thomas Seymour moved differently. He didn't need the seal, he needed an opportunity. Witnesses saw Thomas heading toward Catherine Parr's private quarters with an urgency too sharp to ignore. No one knew exactly what he wanted, but the perceptive one suspected he intended to claim the position of protector of the widowed queen before anyone else could even consider it. A servant heard Catherine's voice through the door, calm but colder than usual. She did not cry. She did not lament, she did not sigh. It was a calmness sharp as a blade, the calmness of a woman who knew the real war only begins after the king dies. They didn't hear the entire conversation, but one sentence is said to have come from her lips. "If anyone wants something from me, they should remember I survived 8 years beside the king." Soft enough not to be a threat, deep enough to make those outside the door step back on their own. And Stephen Gardiner. He arrived later than everyone, crossing the inner courtyard with a somber, heavy presence. He carried no papers or letters, only an old rosary, running each bead through his fingers as if counting the chances that had slipped away from him during the night. Gardiner understood the harsh truth. When the king dies and you are not summoned, you are no longer part of the future. What chilled witnesses most was his demeanor. He did not rage, he did not plead, he did not cling to any faction. He simply walked to the small chapel, knelt, and sat with shoulders so tense it was clear he was holding back more questions than prayers. Those who saw him said he looked like a man wrestling with a single thought. Did Henry die naturally, or did he die separated from the people who could have protected him? No one heard his answer, and no one dared ask. Outside Whitehall, Londoners continued haggling over fish prices, complaining about the weather, tending to their daily errands, completely unaware that their king had taken his final breath the night before. The court kept the silence on purpose, like someone holding a balloon tightly until the knot is fully tied. Because once the news was released, within only hours, the royal seal had to be transferred. The regency announced before the entire council, and every faction would be forced into positions they could no longer change. Edward knew it, Thomas knew it, even Catherine Parr knew it, and so Henry VIII's death became a temporary secret, held back just long enough to secure power before England had the chance to react. When the sun climbed a little higher and the fog thinned, Whitehall finally opened to receive the council. One by one, groups entered, looking around with the caution of people who understood the air had shifted, like a new scent rising from the cold stone. Edward Seymour, now in formal attire, read the opening lines of the Regency proclamation he had prepared himself. Thomas Seymour stood slightly to the right, not the position of a successor, but of someone who wanted that position. When the news of Henry's death was formally read, a few soft sobs rose from distant corners, but most of the hall remained wrapped in heavy silence. No one objected. No one questioned. No one asked, when exactly did the king die? Oddly, or conveniently, everyone pretended that the timing did not matter. Only one man refused to look at Edward, or Thomas, or the proclamation being spoken. Stephen Gardiner. He raised his gaze to the ceiling, as if speaking to Henry somewhere beyond it. Is this truly how you left us? That morning, England's history shifted direction so quietly it almost felt unnatural. No wailing, no chaos, no public struggle, only silence. A silence so profound that many servants later admitted it was the morning when Whitehall felt like the second court, and from that moment the question that has lingered for 5 centuries remained unanswered. Did Henry VIII die in peace, or was he left in peace? Whitehall did not answer that morning, and perhaps it never intended to. Many royal deaths have stirred public curiosity, but very few leave behind an echo as unsettling as the death of Henry VIII. Not simply because the man himself was so infamous, so contradictory, so impossible to predict, but because what happened to his body afterward is what truly sends chills through later generations. If Henry's final night was thick with political shadows, then the days following his death were filled with details so bizarre that people hesitate even now to believe they really happened. And yet, Tudor-era records, though not widely publicized, survived just long enough to become mysteries that have haunted history for centuries. Henry VIII was left untouched for far too long, and the consequences soon appeared. By tradition, a king's body had to be embalmed, prepared, and placed into funeral rites within 24-48 hours, but Henry VIII was different. No one explained clearly why, only that his body lay in the chamber for several days without any treatment. Some say it was due to political disputes, some say it was lack of preparation. Others claimed the court was too chaotic to focus on ritual. Whatever the reason, the price showed itself quickly. The room holding Henry's body became so heavy with odor that servants burned incense and perfumed water day and night. A young servant later said, the air was thick, like a fog trapped inside the chamber. This was no exaggeration. There were no strong preservatives at the time. Winter was not cold enough to slow decomposition, and Henry's body was large, diseased, and failing long before he died. Only a few days later, the corpse began to change, in ways that official historians rarely mention because they are simply too disturbing. On the night the coffin was moved, strange things happened. Once Henry's coffin was finally sealed, Whitehall breathed a sigh of relief. But not for long. Late that night, guards began hearing crackling noises from inside the coffin. At first, they assumed it was wood settling, but the sounds continued. Slow, heavy, like something shifting inside. Tudor chronicler Edward Hall recorded this detail, though he softened his wording to avoid shock. The coffin emitted unusual sounds, as though something within remained lively. At the time, people believed restless souls caused noises, but with modern knowledge, the explanation is simple. Gases from decomposition made the coffin swell and creak. Still, hearing such sounds in the dead silence of Whitehall made the moment terrifying. One guard said he stepped back several paces, fearing the coffin might burst open. And then the most frightening incident took place at Seymour Abbey. This is a real historical detail, documented by several independent sources. When Henry's coffin was transported to Seymour Abbey for ceremonial preparations, an incident occurred that no historian has fully explained. One cold night, the coffin, resting in the Great Hall, began leaking fluid onto the stone floor. Servants rushed over, thinking water was dripping from the roof. But when they touched it, it wasn't water. It wasn't resin, it wasn't oil. It was bodily fluid from the decomposing king, seeping through small cracks in the coffin. The sight horrified the servants so badly they swore the smell clung to them for days. Some of the nuns believed it was divine punishment, especially since Henry had dissolved monasteries and executed clergy. A prophecy of the time even warned that the king shall be licked by dogs. And the story goes that on the very night the coffin leaked, a stray dog wandered into the hall and licked the fluid off the floor. Modern historians call it coincidence, but for the Tudors, it was a terrifying omen. Henry's coffin caused another strange controversy long after his burial. When Edward VI ordered a new chapel built at Windsor, Henry's coffin was placed under a large stone slab. But years later, when the vault was inspected, a strange discovery emerged. Henry's coffin was not where the plans said it would be. It had shifted nearly a meter from its intended position. No records indicated the coffin had ever been opened or moved. No fires had cracked the ground, no construction caused vibrations, and yet the coffin had moved on its own in some sense. Some say the floor had settled, others claimed the leakage years earlier had weakened the structure. But many repeated the half-joking, half-chiding line. No one controlled Henry VIII in life. Perhaps even in death, he still chose where to stand. It sounds humorous until you know everything that had happened before. And the thing Whitehall feared the most, not the smell, not the cracking coffin, not the prophecy. What terrified Whitehall was this question: if Henry died while power was being manipulated behind closed doors, then were all these coffin anomalies truly just biological accidents? Modern historians still debate his cause of death, but some scholars, after re-examining medical records, Tudor poison lore, and political conditions, have said something startling. If Henry VIII was interfered with before he died, then the abnormalities in the coffin are no longer pathology. They are the aftermath of an unnatural death. No one dares confirm it, no one dares deny it, and Whitehall remains silent. Henry VIII ended his life with more mysteries than he ever had in life, and what happened after he died? The rapid decomposition, the leaking coffin, the eerie prophecy, the unexplained shifting of his burial place still leaves later generations with the sense that this story is not just history. It feels like a dark chapter no one wishes to reread at night, yet no one can look away from. Because if Henry's death was surrounded by conspiracy, then his coffin told another story entirely. One that even Henry VIII, the fiercest king of the Tudor dynasty, could no longer control. You've followed me through the final night of Henry VIII, through the cold corridors of Whitehall, through whispered exchanges no scribe ever recorded, and through the dark secrets surrounding the death of a king who once made all of Europe bow its head in caution. And when you connect every thread, from political motives to the disappearance of medical records to the handful of people with access to the king, the result is not an answer, but a silence as thick as Tudor stone walls. Henry VIII was one of the most powerful figures in Europe. But ironically, in his final days, he was surrounded by schemes he no longer had the strength to control. Perhaps he died of illness. Perhaps someone let nature take its course. Perhaps his death was nothing more than a moment destiny chose for him. But in the Tudor court, the truth often mattered far less than who gained power afterward. And the most unsettling part is this: no matter how Henry VIII died, every person who needed him gone benefited. The Seymour faction secured power. Gardiner was silenced. Catherine Parr stepped into freedom. Edward VI took the throne. And the Tudor dynasty shifted onto an entirely new path, a path that might have looked very different if Henry had lived just a few weeks longer. You can believe the medical explanation, you can believe the conspiracy theory, or you can believe that history is sometimes nothing more than the perfect blend of natural circumstance and the desires of the people standing closest to the sickbed. But one thing is certain: the death of Henry VIII was never just a death. It was a transfer of power wrapped in the silk of silence, sealed with ambition, and buried beneath a dynasty that preferred shredding records over confronting the truth. If you've stayed with me all the way to this moment, tell me what you think. Did Henry VIII die from illness or from the very court that served him? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear what you felt during tonight's journey. Thank you for spending your time drifting with me through the corners of history where the light was never meant to reach. If you enjoy this style of storytelling, don't forget to leave a like, turn on notifications, and follow the channel so you won't miss the next Tudor secret. Sleep well, and if this story made it a little harder to fall asleep, then I apologize in advance. I'll see you again on the next journey.